When setting up basic warehousing in Microsoft Dynamics NAV, it's important to know why you want to use warehouse management. This could be because you want to use dedicated warehouse documents to do shipments and the receipt of items in the warehouse, but it could also be the item placement or maybe a combination of the two. If you watched our location video, you already saw that you can set up warehouse management in quite a lot of different ways. I'm going to show you what can be important when you want to set up warehousing in NAV. So let's start with the receipt and put away activity. For example, if you're purchasing items, you can have two physical transactions. You can, but you don't have to use them separated, and that's very important. But this is, from a warehouse point of view, two things that can happen. So first we receive something in the warehouse, and then we'll do the put away in the warehouse. However, we can do these two things in one document, and that's using a purchase order. And so if you haven't set up your location for a warehouse management, you're basically doing the receipt and put away combined in the purchase order. What you can now do is extend this process by using bins. So say the only thing that's important is item placements. I want to keep doing the receipt and the put away together in the purchase order, but I want to be able to specify bins. So that's a possibility that you have. Then you would assign bins in the purchase order. However, you can also decide to use put away documents. So say you want to use a put away document order by order. So in that way, you can use the decentralized document, so where the user can use a warehouse document in order to process the put away. What is important here to realize is that these two are still done together, so they're not yet separated. So we will not have a separate receipt and a separate put away. But by using inventory put away, again, we have specific documents that we can use in the warehouse. Another reason for a company to use warehouse management in NAV can be the ability to receive multiple orders at the same time. And so not order by order, but multiple orders. But if we use only the warehouse receipt, we are doing the receipt and the put away still in one process. So this is still not separated. The most extended version that we can use is the separation of the warehouse receipt and the put away. So in this case, we can use multiple documents so that we have the ability to receive multiple orders at the same time. We will have a separate warehouse receipt and a separate warehouse put away document. So this is a very important overview for receipt and put away. You have the same for pick and shipping. So if we were selling items to a customer, for example, first they should be picked and then shipped. Also here we can combine them in the sales order and if we want to use the bin. Or you can use inventory pick. So in the inventory pick, they're still combined just as with the inventory put away. You may also require the function to ship multiple orders at the same time. And by using warehouse shipment, this function will be enabled. And then last but not least, this option will give us the ability to separate the warehouse pick process and the warehouse shipment process in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. These are two very important overviews that we can use in order to see why do we want to implement warehouse management, what is important for us, and what do we want to emphasize. I'm going to show you now how we can implement this in NAV. This is done by selecting number of fields in the warehouse section of the location card. I'm going to use the search function to search for locations. And if I open the green location, for example, and I go to the warehouse section, here you can see all of the fields that require receive and require shipment. Selecting these fields means that the receiving and shipment of purchase and sales orders, for example, should be done with the warehouse document to warehouse receipt and warehouse shipment. One of the benefits of doing this is that you can receive and ship multiple orders at the same time, just like we saw on the slide. If the feature or function of receiving and shipping multiple orders at the same time is very important, then you should select these fields. You can also select require put away and require pick, which means that after receiving, you will have to use the warehouse put away to put away the items in the warehouse, and the warehouse pick before you can ship and to pick first the items from the warehouse and then ship to the customer. So the combination of these four means that the warehouse documents are used. Then you also have bin mandatory. Bin mandatory means that you'll start using bins in order to keep track of item placement. And so for this warehouse, bin mandatory is not selected, which means that we don't use any bins for the green warehouse. But if I were to go to, say, the silver warehouse, you can see that bin mandatory is selected. If item placement is one of your reasons for using warehouse management in Dynamics NAV, then we should create bins, and an example of a bin is a shelf in a warehouse. Now, before we go into the system and see how we can create bins, I'll show you how it works. So here you can see a warehouse. And what is important is that from the moment we start using bins, each physical transaction of an item should be registered. And if we look at the standard process, you can see, of course, that an item is first received. So we have purchased it from a vendor and we're receiving it in the warehouse. And then after receiving the item in the warehouse, after we've unpacked it, after we've counted it, checked it, and so on, then we can do the put away. And the put away will be done on the bin level. So we will specify on which bin, on which shelf, for example, we want to put away the items. So the put away is a physical transaction that we should register. But also the movement and adjustment, for example, are physical transactions. So if we decide to move an item from one bin to the other, also here in this case, we should register the movements. So then when we start selling items, the first thing that we should do, of course, is pick the item from the warehouse. And so based on the bin where we have stored the item, we will do a pick and then we'll ship it to the customer. You see, it's not only about receiving and shipping items, but it's now also about registering the put away, the movement, the pick transaction, and so on. So that's very important. Let's now have a look in the system at how we can create bins. So based on these typical physical warehouse flows, we'll now have to create bins. For all the locations where bin mandatory is selected, we'll have to set up bins, and the bins will define the layout of the warehouse. So the bins represent shelves that we can have in the warehouse and where we can place items. I will use location silver because it's the one that's set up with the bin mandatory field selected. Now, if I go to bins, you can see here that we have the bins of location silver. So basically what we have here is a code, a description, and whether the bin is empty or not, and if it's a dedicated bin. Let's start with the code. It's quite easy to enter a code. You can do this manually, for example. But what is important is that the code identifies the smallest place that you want to keep track of. But maybe the warehouse shelf is very high and large, which means that it might be more interesting to also include the different layers of the shelf. For example, layer 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so this already means that you'll get more detailed information because the system will then direct you to, for example, S2, which means that you know that you'll have to look on the second layer. But then you can add a third component, which then may be the place on the layer. So what I want to say is that you should create bins based on the most detailed item placement level that you'd like to use. So for the rest, you can enter in a description. You can also set up dedicated bins. Now, a dedicated bin is a bin that you can use, for example, in a manufacturing process. So I can assign a bin as dedicated, and this bin is then assigned to a work center and manufacturing. You will see that the content of the bin can only be used by that specific work center. So once that we have created the bin, we can go one step further. We can also define the bin content. So if I were to click on contents, you can see that our demo company Cronus has defined that item LS75, which is a loudspeaker, has a fixed bin, which is S01001. So these two now have been linked, and this is the fixed place for the item in the warehouse. You have two different warehouse concepts, fixed and floating bins. This is a fixed bin. So this item has a fixed place. Now the fact that the fixed is selected means that the combination or the link between the bin and the item will always be saved by the system, even when the quantity is 0. If fixed would not be selected, then the link is not maintained. Once there's no content anymore in the bin, the system does not maintain or doesn't save the bin contents. Then there's also the field default. Now we can use the field default to get some direction when, for example, putting away items. It's important to realize the difference between fixed and default. So here we can see default and fixed and how we can use them. So default You can only have one default bin per item, while an item can be fixed to more than one bin. And so this means if I have an item, this item can only be default for one bin, while an item can have different fixed bins. Then another thing, if the item quantity goes to 0, the program deletes the bin content. And like I just said, this will not happen if the item is set up as a fixed item for a specific bin. And so the item quantity goes to 0, but the program does not delete the bin content line. The default assignment is like a system-oriented assignment where the user tells the system what bins to suggest first, while the fixed assignment is an organization-oriented assignment where the user tells the system in which bin an item is typically stored. So that's the way you can look at the differences between default and fixed. And that's something we can do, enter bin content and define it as fixed content. Again, you don't have to do this, so this is an option, but it could have the advantage that you can define the fixed places of an item in a warehouse. So if I were to go back to the location, you can see here that based on the default bin, you can specify the default bin selection. So the default bin selection can be based on the fixed bin or can be used on the last used bin. So that's the way you can set it up in the system in order to specify which of the default bins should be. And that sums up setting up basic warehousing in Dynamics NAV. Thanks for watching.